This screencast is a little different than my normal screencast in terms of I've gotten a lot of emails and text and just where I've seen some of you struggling with this type of writing. And we talked about that when we talked about changing from a personal voice from 101 to something more academically based and with academic writing. It is a process. It's a difficult process. You know, in order to be able to successfully analyze, you have to be able to read, you have to be able to understand what you're reading. On top of that, somebody's throwing a prompt at you and asking you to write about this prompt, which means that you have to understand the prompt and you have to be able to find evidence to support the prompt. And so, if I could give you any advice, it would be that lots of advice really, but main advice, when you read, take notes, ask yourself questions, struggle to figure out, to understand what you're reading. And then take your prompts and break them down and get into the habit of brainstorming about the prompt. And so I know that doesn't come naturally. And so I thought I would make a screencast on how to break down a literary analysis prompt so that you're able to write about it. And so I hope this is helpful. And I'm just going to kind of walk you through how I would take a prompt and break it down so that I know how to write about it. I know how to find what I need to write about it within the text. Okay, so the first step is for you to understand all the literary terms in the prompt. Okay, it's literary analysis, so I know I've got to be able to understand what the literary terms are asking me to do. So I have to know what they are in order for me to be able to write with them from any knowledge standpoint. So we studied third-person narration earlier in the term when we did a screencast and notes on point of view and the influence of the narrator, the role of the narrator in a story. So my prompt is this is our first essay prompt, discuss the impact of third-person narration in Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, and Ernest Hemingway's Soldier's Home, and how does that perspective impact how we as readers view the main characters. So my first step to this process of breaking down this prompt is to fully understand what it's asking when it asks me about the impact of third-person narration. So from studying third-person narration, I know this about a third-person narrator. I know that he, she, it, or they, whoever it is not a character in the story. And I know that there's two types. I know that there are omniscient narrators, which are your all-knowing. They move from place to place and back and forth and into and out of characters, and can report not only what the character says and does, but also their thoughts and their feelings. And then we also have a limited narrator, third-person narrator, which is all of those same things, but just from the perspective of one single minor or major character. And so the way that people, places, and events in the story appear to that character is the way they appear to us as the reader, because that's the way they are translated to us. So that limited third person, the reader has access to the thoughts and feelings of the character, but neither the reader, us, or the character themselves can be inside the head of any other character in the story. So I know that from my breakdown of what a third-person narrator is, I know that the narrator plays an important role in how a story develops. They, he, whoever it is, he, she, it, they, help to shape how we view the development of main characters. And I just realized I put development of the main character's development. Let's just main character. This all-knowing voice, this omniscient voice that gives inside information helps clarify the character motives, feelings, and actions. And it's through that outside perspective that we're going to gain an overall picture, a 360 picture, because we have full, unbiased access. Them not being a character in the story, it gives us unbiased access to everything that's happening, as well as what's inside these characters' minds. So now that I've figured that out, for my second step, I have to figure out how the stories would have been different if they'd been written from first or second perspective. You got to figure out what the alternative is to be able to see it clearly. So I have to break down the stories individually to figure it out. So in the story of An Hour was written from first person perspective of Miss Mallard, and we're given only her words and actions from her point of view. We see her as not even sad at the fact that her husband is dead. We see her cry in front of her sister and husband's friend while people are watching, but then she takes herself to her room. She whispers, "Free, free, free," to herself. And we would have also not known about her death from heart failure, because the story would have ended when she ended. So we would have seen her as very selfish and very putting on a show for, the people. But when she was alone, here she is. She's free, free, free. If A Rose for Emily was written from first person of Miss Emily, we would see her as a crotchety old woman who refuses to adapt, who refuses to change to this vastly changing world around her. We would also know about that great secret early on, the fact that she killed her lover so they wouldn't leave her. And then we would also see her actions after the murder, how she slept with his body for years in secret. All of those things would help us, from her perspective, would give us the idea that she was crazy, that she was a bitter old woman with a nasty secret, and we wouldn't understand. If Soldier's Home had been written from a first-person perspective, Harold, we would see him as unfeeling, uncaring, soulless. He returns home late. He's bitter about the lack of understanding he gets when he returns. He mistreats his family, and spends all of his time isolating himself from others, living off his parents, and refusing to get a job and move on with his life. Those are all the things that we would see if these stories were written from the first person perspective of the characters. But they're not. So now, how does that third person perspective change all of that? How does that third person, an outside view, change these characters in our minds? Where is there some kind of common theme or thread that we can follow throughout the story that changes them for us, that makes them less selfish, that makes them less uncaring? And that common theme is sympathy. Can we feel sympathetic for them based off of what we see from the viewpoint of it as a third-person narration? We can only get sympathy for them through a third-person perspective. We would have thought Miss Mallard was heartless. We would have thought Miss Emily was crazy. And we would have thought Krebs was, just kind of an asshole. And so that third-person perspective helps us feel sympathy. So how does it change that? So in the story of An Hour, we get critical background from a third-person narrator on that heart condition, which is why the other characters are so careful to break the news to her so gently. We see her weep uncontrollably in her sister's arms and take herself to her room to be alone. And once she's there, we see the physical and mental struggle that she goes through the eyes of that omniscient narrator who casts these things that she's saying to herself in a new light. We then see her pull herself together to go start a new life, where she ultimately dies from the shock of seeing her husband's return. In A Rose for Emily, that third-person perspective gives us all those background of Miss Emily's life. We see the pain and the grief that she suffers from the death of her father, which makes her clinging onto his body for 3 days understandable. She's grieving. We find out that her father ran off every potential suitor for her from that third-person narrator, guaranteeing that she was going to be alone. And we're happy for the fact that she finally finds love after her father dies with Homer Barron. But then we find out that he's really not that great of a guy. He prefers the company of other men, and he leaves her all the time, and he wants to leave her permanently. We applaud her for not paying her taxes and not giving a reason for purchasing the rat poison. We think she's a hero, right? And after the death of Barron, the hiding of his body, the sleeping with his body, we see that in a new light. She just didn't want to be left alone. And we can understand that. That third-person narration makes her more understandable. So in Soldier's Home, the third-person perspective gives us all the background knowledge that we need to figure out that no one welcomes Krebs home with open arms, that the horrific battles and experiences from the war have damaged him to the point of being numb with no feelings whatsoever and no way to overcome them because no one is helping him. The third-person narrator also helps us see that home is no longer home for him, and things will never be the same ever again. So the last step in my process is to take my knowledge of third-person narration, take my knowledge of how it would be different if it was in first-person narration, and take the knowledge that the third-person perspective helps us see them sympathetically to help us combine all of that together, all these findings, into an analysis to answer the prompt. So in order to do that, I have to have specific, hardcore textual evidence. I've got to go back to my text. I've got to find these details that help me, as the writer, show my audience how third-person narration allows them, the reader, to feel sympathy for these main characters. And so I've got to find the best evidence. I've got to find the best possible way to relate to my audience so there will be no doubt whatsoever that this is how the reader should feel too. So in the story of an hour, how do I show that Miss Mallard is fragile, that she isn't happy her husband is dead, that she actually cared about him, that she may have been in an unhealthy relationship, and that she struggled with being free from him so that they, the reader, will feel sympathy for her? Well, first, she's fragile. I need to remind my readers that she suffers from a heart condition. I know that she isn't happy that her husband is dead because she wept at once with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms as soon as she heard the news. She's not happy that he's dead. She's feeling the grief of it. That wasn't some waterworks that she was able to turn on at a drop of a hat. She feels the grief of that. I need to tell my reader that she had no identity of her own, which I know as the reader, the first reader, because it was only after her husband's death that she could be Louise. It's paragraph 17, right? She realized that she would have a long procession of years just for herself, where there would be no powerful will bending hers. She was clearly constricted in her life by the will of her husband. Now, that doesn't mean he was abusive. As a matter of fact, the story tells us that he never looked on her save with love. He never looked at her in a hateful way. He loved her. However, she had no identity of her own under him. She's also initially horrified at the thoughts of her being free from him. We see that. Her chest is rising and falling tumultuously, and she is physically striving to beat those feelings back with her will, and she's powerless to do so. She's not happy that he's dead, and it doesn't initially strike her as some, oh yeah, I'm free from this. She's horrified by those thoughts. With her chest rising and falling tumultuously, she's striving to beat it back with her physically, with her hands, and she she's uncomfortable with those feelings. And all of those things combined will help me show that Miss Mallard is a sympathetic character to my reader. I've got hard evidence to do it. I'm ready to write it down. I'm ready to put it down in writing. I'm going to stop the screencast and continue with part 2 for the other 2 stories.